Cool. Thanks, Iggy. Okay, so hi, everyone. I'm Jarrod. As Iggy said, I do some design stuff for Standard Bank, helping them make some cool things. And I'm also part of a startup called fikatime.app, which is a Microsoft Teams bot that helps pay up employees for random coffee, helping them feel socially connected and avoid burnout and feeling isolated, etc. But we're going to jump right in. So my talk is about friction. First of all, this line that I always hear in job specs, I heard earlier we are listening to job specs about being a ninja, etc. I see this line that says, remove friction from the user experience. And every time I see this line in job specs for designers, it always grates my cheese a little. My whole talk is about friction and how, just like carbs in the 90s, it became seen as this evil that had to be removed. But let's just take a minute to imagine how great experiences can get ruined in a friction-free environment. First off, food, right? Imagine if you're eating this beautiful textural medley of flavor where you break bread with others, talk, drink wine, spend time together, and of course, you're eating all these fantastic things. But instead, you remove the friction and replace everything with a pill that you pop into your mouth, have a glass of water, and instantly full. Friction-free. Then what about travel? You get the urge to go to Paris, see the Eiffel Tower, Arc de Triomphe, or Champs-Élysées. Who needs a 12-hour flight? You could do a virtual tour from your laptop. Click, click, click. I'm sure some of us have actually tried this during lockdown, but I'm curious to know, like, did this actually quench your thirst or quench your wanderlust, right? Friction-free, again. And then sex. Okay, well, I think this one's pretty obvious how disappointing it would be in this type of environment. So, to make sure that we're on the same page, what I mean by friction is I'm talking about any activity or process that slows down the user's ability to complete a task or reach their objective in the most efficient manner possible. Efficient is the key word here. Instead of trying to build it up to the end, I'm going to get to my point straight away. This is what I want you to take away, is friction is not the enemy. It can be useful and should be incorporated as any tool at your disposal. That's it. I'm going to dive into this in more detail, but in case you fall asleep, get distracted or whatever, you have the point I wanted to make. I'm doing this because of the current situation we find ourselves in. If this was an in-person presentation, I'd be walking around, cup of coffee in my hand, engaging with you. You would have had to get out of bed, change your PJs, put on your fancy face, sit in traffic, find a chair, also make small talk with someone that ends up sitting next to you between the presentations. Now you don't have that friction. You could be sitting in your bed with chips and dip, jumping between emails, just having this on audio, finishing out some work that you need to do. And the cost of this friction being removed is my ability to hold your attention. But you can go ahead and prove me wrong and stay focused. So how did we get here? Like with most things, it's a sign of the times. As technology improved and competitors enter the market, especially using technology, more features get created, more abilities get added, and then they churn these out, leading to very bloated products. It's no wonder that there was a hunger for cleaner and simpler flows, just like Web 1.0 designs looked, floating GIFs and fire and all those type of features, right? And then designers came in like Marie Kondo and started removing all the bloat so that we focus on the actual user experience, which had a direct impact on customer satisfaction. That's when business people woke up and were like, okay, they started falling in love with terms like UX and removing friction. However, just like in an episode of Marie Kondo, it's really not about throwing out everything or throwing out as much as possible, but about keeping what actually sparks joy. And this is where it gets tricky. I'm not advocating for removing friction completely. I mean, I don't want to undo all the work that had to go in to get us to this point where we have cleaner interfaces, where there is a focus on beautiful but meaningful, minimal journeys. What I'm talking about is if we add friction in just the right amount and at the right place at the right time, friction can actually create stronger and more meaningful connections between your users and your products for achieving what their goal is, even if it's not in the most efficient way to reach their goal. Okay, so let's actually break into one of the case studies in which this was a very prominent feature. The most legendary of which was P. Duff and Sons, which was a molasses company, and they ended up making cake mixes back in the 1940s, selling to the American public. Now, according to legend, and yes, there is data to suggest that the story may have been framed a certain way over time, but never let the facts get in the way of telling a good story. So P. Duff and Sons were selling these cake mixes, and all you had to do was add water and then mix it up, put it in the oven, and you're good to go. You got a beautiful cake. What happened is that sales started to decline. So they got a researcher, a very famous researcher, the guy who coined the term focus group in the first place. And when he did this research into why sales are going down, he found out that their customers, the housewives, didn't feel involved in the process. They actually felt guilty because they're producing this beautiful cake, people are complimenting them, but didn't feel like they did much work. So based on the recommendation from this research, the company actually changed their mix. They removed the dehydrated eggs that were part of the package and asked customers to add 2 eggs of their own, right? Adding friction. Now, not only did the customers feel more involved, but they actually felt worthy of the praise they were getting for their baking. And thus the story goes that sales skyrocketed. Okay, but there's another company that's really famous for using this strategy. You see by the colors here. And I think there was some mention of it earlier. They're so famous for this that the bias that is used to describe this phenomenon is named after them. In behavior economics, it's called the Ikea effect, right? Ikea is famous for making people pay for furniture that they actually have to assemble themselves. So not too long ago, a friend of mine was relaying to me on a video call about how annoying Ikea is. He hated the experience, saying that he just wanted to buy a piece of furniture. He wanted the end result. He didn't want to have to build the whole thing himself. However, a week later, when I asked him, how's that piece of furniture going? Did you manage to finish it? He couldn't stop talking about it. He was so proud of how beautiful it ended up. And more importantly, he was so proud of what a good job he had done. And this is the Ikea effect. It's a bias we have where we tend to highly exaggerate the value we place on things that we build ourselves, regardless of the end result of quality. And it's the reason we tend to overvalue things like our houses when we put it on the market because of the amount of time we've put into it. Yes, we opened up the kitchen. We built a wall over here. We've done this amazing garden. You know, the buyer doesn't care about those things, or may not care about those things. But we feel that because the effort we put into it, how could they not? And we think the value is actually worth more. So, as you can imagine, this is quite a complicated and multidisciplinary outcome. But I'm going to give you the 10-second crash course on why this works, if you get it right. The idea is friction requires effort to overcome it. Effort is a form of investment. And because of a number of different things that we hold inside of us, like loss aversion, we want to hold on to that investment. We are vested. So we end up forming these stronger bonds with whatever we've invested in. Perhaps you think my examples are a bit too anecdotal. So what I'm going to do is we're going to do a simple thought experiment here, right? I'm not going to ask you to have to answer or raise your hands or any of that stuff. But what I want you to do is think of one of your close bonds, so a human relationship, whether it's a friend, a lover, a family member, perhaps your own child, or a pet for some people, Now I want you to compare that relationship to other not so strong relationships. Did that relationship in question, the one you have to hold in your mind right now, involve less friction, effort, investment over time, or more of it? Chances are it required more, like way more friction, effort, and investment, right? Because human relationships are one of the most frictionful experiences we could actually have. They're high investment, So how do we actually go ahead and start using this friction? Like, how do we use it in our products? And some of the best examples that I've seen and I've gone through is actually game design. Games are one of the most prominent uses of friction to help endear customers or users to their products. Now, people often confuse gamification with game design, but I'm not jumping down that rabbit hole right now, right? They're different things. We are going to look at game design specifically and look at some of the nudges that they use, that game designers use to build more investment in the game and thus a stronger bond with the product. This is Call of Duty. It's a screen from Call of Duty. And it's a game that I started playing much more regularly now than I have in a while. When I first started Call of Duty, I absolutely hated it because I was useless. I'm still pretty useless, but I was really useless back then. And as soon as I jumped into these games, I didn't last more than a minute or two, even a minute seems like quite a bit of time. It was probably around 15 seconds or so. And that's how these massive multiplayer games work. There's full of experts that are playing the game, and you jump in, and before you can even figure out if your shoelaces are tied, you're shot, and okay, you did a game, right? So I was convincing myself that I'm going to stop playing this game. I told my friends, who was the initial group that I started playing with, and I said, hey, I'm not going to play this game anymore because I don't want to invest any more time in something that I feel that's only going to make me feel incapable. But then something happened. Something magical happened when I got my first kill. It was a validation of the time I had invested in the product, in the game itself. And soon as I had that, I was like, okay, maybe I'll try a little more. And soon my numbers started to grow, and the growth started to be more consistent. I also saw that my time spent playing compared to some of the other friends showed my difference in skill level. So when friction is added in these layers, I can break it up into creating these smaller mini goals where I didn't focus on trying to be the best. I focused on just trying to get a kill, just trying to be able to get to this level. And that allowed me to break this very huge goal into smaller mini objectives. And that allowed me to spend more time. Each time I achieved some goal, I spent more time and invested more time. When I invest that time, I want to spend more time, and so on, the cycle goes, right? But let's look at what's called the infinite game. This is the one where the avatars are more or less real. More or less. LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Line, TikTok, etc. These platforms rely heavily on this investment principle for friction. They will add friction by asking users to fill out a bunch of details. Again, doing this piece by piece. That way, you invest more time. As soon as you invest some time, you're more willing to invest more time. And so on the cycle goes. Snap is famous for adding so much friction to their initial UI to keep certain demographics out, right? It was one of those types of apps that you had to learn how to use it from somebody else who already knew how to use it. That way they kept the grandpas, the grandmas, the parents, etc. out of the platform. TikTok is another example of this. In a great letter by Alex Danko, who is one of the founders of Shopify, on social capital, Alex talks about how TikTok is able to dominate the youth market because they use cultural friction as both a barrier and a doorway, right? Outsiders will often say about TikTok things like, is it just for copying people's dance moves? Why would anyone want to see that? I just don't get it, right? And this forms a natural barrier to keeping the market they want in and the market they don't want out. It also allows their content creators to create more content that appeals to that market. That's how friction starts acting as a doorway for those who know how to capitalize on this process or this principle. And if they don't, then they learn very quickly, because TikTok has these really short feedback loops, which allows the user to thrive, the users that thrive to adapt quickly and evolve. It's more content driven than profile driven, all through using this type of friction. One of the experts in game design for a product is Rahul Vora, right, who's founder of Superhuman. And it's a classic case of using friction to build up commitment and using the investment principle. At a time when people were given a great email product, right? This was brought at a time when Gmail was already established, and people were getting this really great email product for free. Well, great compared to what was there before it. It was free, and Superhuman comes along and says, okay, we're also making an email product, even though there's a ubiquitous one out there that's free, and we're going to charge you for it. This is like being asked to pay for search. Not only did they want you to pay for it, but you had to be referred to be able to even get access to this product. Otherwise, you sit on this really long waiting list. And this sounds ridiculous. Talk about friction, right? But they had one of the most successful pre-launch products ever. And it doesn't stop there. Even after you get on, they still ask you to go through a 30-minute demo to use their product, to learn how to use it. And this friction allows their team to better understand their users and make sure that they are going through the process, that they learn what are the basic steps to become an optimal user of the product. Okay. As you can tell, this can turn into quite a detailed process, and each is a case-by-case study. Now, I'm not going to break it down into how you can actually use this in a step-by-step format, because there's a lot to it. But instead of trying to give you like some, trying to work off how do you get to Nash equilibrium payoff and etc. in game theory to understand if users will tack onto this method, I'm going to give you some basic principles. First of all, when should you be using friction? There are a couple of examples when you should start using it, or when you would like to use it. One, it's branding. When you want to endear them to the brand, when you want to build up the anticipation or commitment to the brand, like Superhuman did. Second is if you're protecting your users, when what the users do might prevent them from achieving their objectives or might be harmful to them. Let's take an example of maybe a legal document, right, where they have to go through this flow and they take on a loan. You want to make sure that they are going through the necessary steps to understand what's the impact of them taking that loan. You can introduce friction. And then lastly, the other example is the learning curve, when a user needs to be educated to reach the level that they are optimal users. This is usually broken down into many stages, but you introduce friction slowly but surely. Okay, so there's a bunch of examples here of what you could do and principles to apply when to apply friction, right? You need to understand what's important to your users. Too much friction, you lose the user. Too little friction, you lose the user over time, so they don't come back as repeated users. Break the friction and the rewards into layers. They must trust in the system. There must be examples of overcoming the friction, like in the case of TikTok. They have these people that are doing really well on TikTok, and those become examples for people to say, oh, it's achievable. It's something aspirational to reach to. Self-awareness for the investment. There needs to be some way that they validate, I've spent time on it and I'm getting something in return for my investment. And then you need to have short feedback loops, right, where there's a constant feedback so they can adjust towards the friction. But the most important part of this is one, you need to understand what's important to your users. And secondly, friction must be tied to an emotional state. Okay, so a lot of this talk may sound like I'm trying to manipulate users or trick them into doing something, dark patterns, etc. But dark patterns are not just as clear-cut as what you do, but about how you do them and what you're trying to achieve with them. Here's an example of how removing friction can actually be done for nefarious purposes. Casinos are brilliant at removing friction. Slot machines in particular are expert examples of this. They started off with slot arms that you had to pull and move that to just a button that you can just press 25 times or whatever it is. They went from having to put change into a machine to feeding notes or a credit card, and then being able to preload your cash onto a digital card. Again, removing friction. The friction that builds in your body was even removed. You didn't have to stand anymore. They have seats there. You don't have to leave to get drinks or snacks. They have people that walk around that will say, hey, we can bring you what you need. You never have to figure out if it's day or night. I used to work as an engineer at a casino company, and people would often ask, are the games fixed? But it doesn't necessarily have to be fixed. What the game makers understand very well is that they play the long game. If you remove the friction to make sure that they stay there long enough, they're getting their money back. It's no wonder that slot machines have a much shorter time for people getting addicted than other forms of traditional gambling, such as blackjack or poker, etc. And that's because the latter, like poker and blackjack, actually require you to take a pause, to make a decision, to think, oh, what should I play next? And that takes you out of that flow where you've been conditioned, just press a button. So friction, just like any other tool in our toolkit as designers, can be used for negative outcomes or positive outcomes. It's really up to you how you want to use it. So this talk is really not about addicting the users or tricking them into being more attached to your product. At its core, it's about understanding that you can help them reach their own objectives through an enriched as opposed to efficient path. We humans as a species are a product because of friction, right? That's how evolution happens. And if we reframe friction to taking a break or trying something new or just slowing down, those are also frictions. Just as in life, is that such a bad thing to do those? At Fika Time, we've seen the impact of using friction by helping people take breaks instead of constantly working, especially through this pandemic, fighting isolation by meeting new people, the friction of meeting somebody else and having a conversation. Slowly but surely, this friction over time helps build up value. And we've seen how it's endeared people to our brand. So friction must have a place in our world. And this talk was purely about getting you to understand, don't be afraid of friction. Somewhere along the lines, we thought that we had to remove it, but it's something we can use, something we can actually add value to products. And perhaps those job descriptions need to be a little less prescriptive and just be described as helping users have a great experience. Cool. That's it. Stop sharing.
Thank you so much for that talk. There was actually lots of comments on the right-hand side in relation to your talks. I think your slides definitely promoted some comments. But I see we've got a question here.
Sure.
And that's from Seth. I'm interested to debate this hypothesis further. In my mind, a lot of examples exhibited good engagement design. What would you say is the difference, similarity?
The difference and similarity between good engagement design and using friction. So I don't think it's a case of using one thing or the other. I think a lot of these different tools add up as a piece of a bigger puzzle, right? So if you want to think of, let's take an example of Takealot, right? They once described their competitive advantage as being their distribution network in South Africa. And I would argue that that distribution network allows them to have a good engagement strategy, because it allows the users to be able to pick up and send items off as soon as they don't like it, or be able to have that no type of fast delivery system. So these aren't as clear cut as saying, look, friction alone is what you need to include, or a good engagement strategy is what you need. These are all pieces of a bigger puzzle. And I think sometimes we get a bit too locked down into what the words mean, as opposed to what's the end effect and how these things contribute to one another. But yeah, I think the point is these things should be debated, right? There's no one true opinion of saying this is the way to go. Everyone's got their own view of these things. And I think the more we engage as designers, the better we are able to come up with new approaches to solving the same problems. We don't end up with everyone creating these websites or products that go down the same road and look exactly the same. Cool.
Constant change. Thank you for that. I hope that answers the question, Seth. Just checking if there's any more questions from anyone else. Lots of applause, really cool talks, brilliant talk, very cool, very interesting. Lots of positive feedback. Just checking if there's any more questions from anyone else before we jump into the second last session for the day. If there are any questions, or anyone thinks of a few questions later, or wants to engage with Jarrod, Twitter is Jarrod Gabriel, so at Jarrod Gabriel. He's on LinkedIn as well. I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to chat or talk about this, I would love to engage in a debate around some of these ideas. I think it's cool for people to see different views being debated. Maybe it's something you guys could tackle at some point. We get a debate going with different designers taking different approaches to things, and we all get to kind of see that play out like a political debate. It would be kind of fun, I think.
I've got one more question.
Yeah,
sorry.
Cool.
So the one more question from Candice. Are there any examples of good friction in a support context?
Support context. I'm sure there are. I'm trying to think of one off the top of my mind right now. For support, I know that some of these organizations, like the startups, have used very detailed onboarding, right? Where they use like these 1 hour sessions beforehand and use that as a way to prevent support tickets going through later on. That's a form of friction that's been added at the beginning. But in a call center environment, perhaps you could introduce friction can be used to help make it feel less transactional, right? So Dan Ariely is quite a popular writer on behavior economics. And if you look at some of his books around motivation and payoff, he uses some examples where they talk about how reducing things to a transactional level can ruin an experience. So maybe in a support context, not having it be a thing that, okay, I log a ticket, then that ticket's a number, it gets passed between people constantly, but having like a go-to account manager. Right now, I think with technology, you could actually facilitate this where it wasn't possible before. So that might be one way in which you could use it. But yeah, it really depends on more information around what is the support setup, what is the structure, how is support handled currently. You'd have to kind of look at all those different factors before you think about where to introduce the friction.
Awesome. Thank you. I hope that answers the question, Candice. Thank you so much. If there aren't any more questions, we're going to jump into the second last session. Jarrod, again, thank you so much for an awesome talk.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for having me.